The billionaire wasn't looking for love that night. He only wanted dinner. But after saving a waitress from a drugged drink, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman whose life he had just saved. Some people save your life by pulling you away from danger. Others save it by reminding you that kindness still exists. On a rainy Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, the windows of Ashford Grill shimmered beneath the glow of streetlights while the steady rhythm of silverware, quiet conversations, and soft jazz wrapped the restaurant in a familiar warmth. Claire Bennett adjusted the sleeve of her white shirt, balanced 3 dinner plates with practiced confidence, and greeted another table with the same gentle smile she had worn through the past 9 hours. Most customers never remembered her name. They remembered how quickly their coffee was refilled or how warmly they were welcomed after a long day. That was enough for Claire. She had learned years ago that dignity rarely arrived with applause. It lived inside ordinary moments that nobody else noticed. Across the room, Ethan Walker quietly set aside his phone as his business associates debated quarterly numbers that suddenly felt far less interesting than they had 10 minutes earlier. At 39, Ethan had built one of the country's fastest-growing logistics companies. Yet the more successful he became, the more invisible, genuine people seemed to grow. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every compliment seemed connected to a favor. Every invitation carried an expectation. Ashford Grill had become one of the few places where nobody treated him like a headline. The staff simply served dinner and moved on with their evening. That simple honesty was why he returned almost every Thursday. Claire approached with a calm expression, placing fresh glasses of sparkling water on the table before politely asking whether anyone needed another minute to decide. Ethan noticed the same thing he always did. She never interrupted. She never rushed anyone. She somehow made busy look peaceful. Before anyone answered, another server hurried over carrying a colorful cocktail that had been ordered moments earlier for a nearby guest. "Excuse me, Claire," the young server whispered. "Table 14 changed seats. This one's yours now." Claire thanked her with a quiet smile and accepted the drink, carefully checking the tiny order tag attached to the stem. At that exact moment, Ethan's attention shifted. It wasn't the drink itself. It was the man standing near the hallway who seemed strangely interested in where the glass was going. The man's eyes followed Claire instead of the table. When Claire paused briefly to greet an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, the stranger looked away almost too quickly. Ethan had spent decades making decisions based on details everyone else ignored. Something about that moment unsettled him. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. Maybe it was simply the look on the stranger's face before he disappeared into the crowd. Claire reached the corner booth, smiling politely as she prepared to set the cocktail beside the waiting customer. But another guest waved her over with a simple request for extra napkins. "I'll be right back," Claire said kindly, placing the untouched glass on a nearby service station for only a few seconds before walking away. Ethan watched from across the room. His conversation faded into distant noise. He saw the same unfamiliar man pass by the service station without looking directly at it. He saw a brief movement of one hand near the counter. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would notice. Just one quick motion before the man continued walking toward the exit. Ethan stood before he realized he had made the decision. His colleagues exchanged confused glances as he crossed the dining room with steady steps. Claire returned, thanked the waiting guests for their patience, and reached for the cocktail with the same calm professionalism she showed every customer. Just as she lifted the glass toward the table, Ethan quietly placed his hand between hers and the drink. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably serious. "Please don't serve this one." Claire blinked in surprise. Around them, conversations continued, unaware that time seemed to pause for only 2 people. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. Ethan studied the untouched glass for one long second before meeting her eyes. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "But I'd rather be wrong than ignore the feeling telling me something isn't right." Claire looked at Ethan for a long moment, searching his face for any sign that this was some elaborate joke, but there was nothing playful in his expression. There was only quiet certainty. The restaurant manager noticed the unusual exchange and quickly approached with a polite smile that faded the moment Ethan calmly explained what he had observed. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody caused a scene. The glass was simply set aside, while another fresh drink was prepared for the waiting guest. Within minutes, the manager thanked Ethan for mentioning his concern, even if it ultimately proved to be nothing. Claire nodded politely and returned to work because the dinner rush never paused for unanswered questions. Plates still needed carrying. Coffee still needed refilling. Children still laughed over dessert while couples celebrated birthdays beneath the warm lights. Yet every time Claire walked past the service station, she found herself replaying the moment in her mind. Ethan had not looked frightened. He had looked experienced, as if he had learned long ago that paying attention often mattered more than reacting quickly. By the time the last guests drifted into the cool Chicago night, the rain had softened into a gentle mist. Claire folded clean napkins beside the espresso machine while the closing staff stacked chairs and wiped polished wooden tables. The manager stepped out of his office holding a small notebook. His expression was noticeably more serious now. He quietly explained that security cameras had confirmed an unfamiliar customer lingering near the service station moments before Claire returned for the drink. Nothing else could be confirmed, and no accusations would be made without evidence, but the restaurant had decided to review its safety procedures immediately. Claire listened in silence. A strange chill settled over her despite the warmth of the kitchen behind her. She realized that if Ethan had chosen to ignore the uneasy feeling that crossed his mind, she might never have known that something unusual had happened at all. She thanked the manager, collected her coat, and stepped outside into the damp evening air. The sidewalks reflected the city lights like scattered stars beneath her feet. She normally enjoyed the quiet walk to the elevated train station because it gave her time to leave work behind before returning to her small apartment on the north side. Tonight, however, every passing stranger seemed just a little more noticeable. Every reflection in every storefront reminded her how easily an ordinary evening could change direction because one person decided not to stay silent. Across town, Ethan sat alone in the back seat of his sedan while the skyline drifted past the windows. His assistant had already sent tomorrow's meeting schedule, but he barely glanced at it. Instead, he found himself thinking about the waitress who had thanked him with genuine sincerity instead of dramatic emotion. She had not asked who he was. She had not requested a business card. She had not tried to continue the conversation. She simply returned to serving people with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening. That stayed with him more than he expected. Success had introduced Ethan to countless impressive people, yet genuine humility had become increasingly rare. Claire reminded him of something he had almost forgotten during the years spent building companies and negotiating contracts. Character often revealed itself most clearly when nobody believed they were being watched. The following morning, Claire woke before sunrise as she always did. She brewed a single cup of coffee in her modest kitchen, watered the small basil plant growing beside the window, and opened a worn notebook filled with handwritten goals. At the top of one page, written in careful blue ink months earlier, was a sentence she refused to erase. Return to nursing school. She traced the words gently with one finger before closing the notebook again. Life had demanded different priorities after her mother became ill several years before, and tuition had slowly become an impossible expense. Working double shifts had kept the lights on and the rent paid, but dreams had a quiet way of waiting even when people convinced themselves they had moved on. Claire smiled to herself, slipped on her jacket, and headed out the door just as the first rays of morning sunlight broke through the clouds above Chicago. Unaware that somewhere across the city, Ethan Walker had already found himself wondering whether the quiet waitress with kind eyes and unshakable grace was doing exactly what she always did, putting everyone else first before ever thinking about herself. 3 days passed, yet the memory refused to fade. Ethan Walker had negotiated acquisitions worth billions of dollars without losing sleep, but he found himself thinking about a waitress whose name had quietly settled into the back of his mind. It was not because she had thanked him. It was because she had not expected anything afterward. That difference lingered longer than he cared to admit. On Monday morning, while executives filled the glass conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, Ethan listened as quarterly projections appeared across the massive presentation screen. Revenue had exceeded expectations. Investors were pleased. Expansion into 2 additional states was moving ahead of schedule. Around the table, confident voices discussed percentages, contracts, and market share, but Ethan's attention drifted for only a second when someone mentioned employee retention. He suddenly remembered the way Claire had greeted every customer with the same warmth, whether they ordered a $10 sandwich or an expensive steak dinner. Genuine professionalism could not be measured on a spreadsheet. It came from character. That afternoon, Claire was living a completely different reality. She finished her lunch break sitting alone on a small bench behind the restaurant, reading a borrowed nursing textbook with several worn pages carefully taped back together. 20 minutes was never enough time to study, but she refused to waste even a single one. Medical terminology filled the margins with handwritten notes from years earlier when she had believed graduation was only months away. Sometimes she wondered if life had quietly closed that chapter forever. Then she would remember her mother's favorite words. Dreams do not expire. People only stop walking toward them. Claire closed the book as her phone vibrated with a message from Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly widow who lived in her apartment building. Thank you again for helping carry my groceries yesterday. Claire smiled without replying immediately. She had simply noticed the older woman struggling with several heavy bags and offered to help. To Claire, kindness had never required an audience. Inside the restaurant, another busy evening unfolded with familiar rhythm. The hostess welcomed guests. Glasses clinked softly beneath warm lights. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the dining room. Claire moved gracefully from table to table, remembering birthdays, allergy requests, and children's favorite desserts without writing everything down. Several regular customers greeted her by name. One elderly couple always requested her section because, as they often joked, she made ordinary dinners feel like anniversaries. Near closing time, a father entered with his young son, who looked no older than 8. The boy stared quietly at the dessert display before lowering his eyes and whispering that he did not want anything sweet after all. Claire noticed the father counting folded bills inside his wallet while pretending not to. She smiled warmly, disappeared into the kitchen, and returned a few minutes later carrying a slice of apple pie with 2 forks. The chef accidentally made an extra slice tonight, she said gently. It would be a shame if nobody enjoyed it. The father's eyes filled with gratitude that words could not fully express. Claire simply wished them a pleasant evening and continued serving other tables without expecting thanks. Unknown to her, someone standing near the entrance had witnessed the entire exchange. Ethan had stopped by the restaurant after a meeting nearby, intending only to pick up a takeout order before heading home. Instead, he found himself quietly observing a moment that no camera would ever record and no newspaper would ever publish. Claire had not offered the dessert because she recognized him or because someone important was watching. She believed nobody was paying attention. That realization mattered more than the gesture itself. Ethan accepted his order from another server and walked toward the exit without interrupting her work. As he reached the front door, he glanced back one final time. Claire was kneeling beside an elderly guest, patiently explaining how to use the restaurant's digital payment screen without making the woman feel embarrassed. Her voice remained soft. Her smile never looked forced. Ethan stepped outside into the cool evening air, carrying far more than dinner. For the first time in years, he found himself curious about a person instead of impressed by a resume. He did not know where Claire had come from, what challenges she carried, or why someone with such quiet intelligence remained working double shifts in a neighborhood restaurant. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The feeling that had stopped him from ignoring one suspicious moment a few nights earlier was returning once again. Only this time it was telling him that some of the most extraordinary people lived ordinary lives, where almost nobody thought to look. The following Friday arrived with crisp autumn air sweeping through downtown Chicago, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and damp leaves along the sidewalks outside Ashford Grill. Claire unlocked the employee entrance 15 minutes early, as she always did, greeting the dishwasher, helping the pastry chef unload fresh ingredients, and checking every table before the first reservation appeared. Nobody asked her to do those things. She simply believed that if everyone made one person's day a little easier, the entire restaurant felt different. Her manager often noticed, but rarely mentioned it, because Claire always shrugged away compliments as if they belonged to someone else. Shortly before lunch service began, one of the newer servers accidentally dropped an entire tray of polished glasses. The sharp sound echoed through the dining room, followed by complete silence. The young woman froze in embarrassment, her eyes filling with panic as several customers turned toward the noise. Claire crossed the room. Without hesitation, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and smiled warmly. "Everybody has a first bad day," she said softly. "Let us clean this up together." Within moments, the tension disappeared. The customers returned to their conversations. The young server laughed nervously before thanking Claire with genuine relief. It was another small moment that would never appear in a performance review, but quietly shaped the culture around her. Across the city, Ethan finished a breakfast meeting earlier than expected. As his driver waited outside the office building, Ethan surprised even himself by asking to stop near Ashford Grill instead of returning directly to headquarters. He told himself he simply wanted lunch before his afternoon appointments. Yet deep inside, he knew that explanation felt incomplete. He had become curious about the ordinary life of someone who seemed extraordinary without trying to be. Entering the restaurant just after noon, Ethan chose a table near the windows instead of his usual private corner. Claire did not notice him immediately because she was helping an elderly customer carefully read a menu after the man admitted he had forgotten his reading glasses at home. She patiently described every special, never rushing despite the growing lunch crowd. Ethan watched quietly. Wealth had introduced him to luxury hotels, private clubs, and executive dining rooms across the country, but very few places offered something as valuable as sincere patience. When Claire finally approached his table, her expression remained exactly the same as it had been with every other guest. Warm, professional, completely natural. "Good afternoon," she said with a gentle smile. "It is nice to see you again. I hope you are having a good week." Ethan smiled back. "It has been busy," he admitted. "How about yours?" Claire laughed softly. "Busy usually means people are gathering with friends and family. That is never a bad thing." She handed him the menu before adding, "The tomato basil soup is especially good today. The chef has been proud of it since 6 this morning." Ethan noticed something unusual. She recommended the special because she genuinely believed it was good, not because it was expensive. After placing his order, he watched the rhythm of the restaurant unfold around her. Claire remembered children's names, asked one regular customer how his niece's surgery had gone, congratulated another couple on becoming grandparents, and quietly replaced a burned sandwich without charging the embarrassed college student who apologized repeatedly for dropping it on the floor moments after receiving it. She did each act with such quiet consistency that nobody seemed surprised anymore. They simply expected kindness from her because she offered it every day. As Ethan finished his soup, he noticed Claire sitting alone for exactly 5 minutes during her break at a small table near the back hallway. She opened the same worn nursing textbook he had glimpsed tucked beneath her arm a few days earlier. Highlighters, handwritten notes, and neatly folded pages revealed years of determined study rather than casual reading. Before she could finish a single chapter, another server rushed over looking overwhelmed by a sudden group reservation. Claire immediately closed the book without hesitation, stood, and returned to the dining room with the same calm smile she always carried. Ethan watched the unopened textbook remain behind on the empty chair. Something inside him shifted. She had given up precious minutes that could have brought her closer to her own dreams simply because someone else needed help. In boardrooms, people often spoke about leadership as though it belonged only to those with impressive titles. Sitting quietly inside a neighborhood restaurant, Ethan began to wonder if real leadership looked much more like a waitress who kept choosing others even when nobody was keeping score. The weekend arrived with clear skies stretching above Chicago, and Ashford Grill filled earlier than usual as families, tourists, and longtime regulars escaped the cool autumn breeze outside. Claire moved through the crowded dining room with effortless rhythm, balancing trays, remembering names, and offering the same sincere smile, whether someone ordered a simple cup of coffee or a full 3-course meal. She never hurried a lonely customer who wanted to talk for a few extra minutes, and she never allowed a busy shift to become an excuse for forgetting that every person who walked through the front door carried a story no menu could reveal. Ethan returned shortly after noon, this time alone. He chose the same table by the window, but unlike previous visits, he left his laptop inside the car. He realized he was no longer coming for convenience. He was coming because the restaurant reminded him that genuine human connection still existed somewhere beyond conference rooms and financial reports. Claire greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered everyone else. "Welcome back," she said. "The chef finally perfected the pumpkin soup after changing the recipe 3 times this week." He has been hoping someone notices. Ethan smiled. Then I suppose I should help reward his persistence. Claire laughed softly before writing down the order. There was no awkwardness between them, only the comfortable ease of two people who respected one another without fully knowing why. As lunch service continued, Ethan quietly observed something he had begun noticing every time he visited. Claire never seemed to seek recognition, yet appreciation followed her naturally. The dishwasher thanked her for helping unload supplies before sunrise. The hostess smiled after Claire quietly adjusted a reservation mistake without mentioning whose error it had been. Even the chef, whose standards were famously demanding, softened whenever Claire complimented the kitchen staff before complimenting herself. During a brief lull, Ethan watched through the front window as Claire stepped outside carrying a small paper bag. Across the street sat an elderly man wrapped in a faded jacket, reading yesterday's newspaper while slowly sipping plain coffee from a paper cup. Claire walked over, handed him the bag with a gentle smile, exchanged a few quiet words, and returned inside carrying nothing except the empty paper bag folded neatly in one hand. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. Ethan had. When she returned to refill his coffee, he asked carefully, "Does he come by often?" Claire glanced through the window before answering, "Almost every Saturday." Ethan nodded toward the empty bag. "You bring him lunch every week?" Claire looked slightly surprised by the question, then shrugged almost apologetically. "He reminds me of my grandfather. He never asks for anything, and he always says thank you even when all I bring is soup." Ethan looked back toward the sidewalk where the elderly man smiled quietly while opening the paper bag. "Does the restaurant know?" Claire smiled. "The chef pretends he does not notice that one bowl of soup disappears every Saturday. I pretend I do not notice that he prepares a larger batch than we actually need." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, allowing the silence to settle naturally between them. There was something remarkable about kindness shared without anyone claiming credit. Before he could respond, a voice called Claire from across the dining room. A little girl had accidentally spilled orange juice across the tablecloth and burst into tears, convinced she had ruined everyone's lunch. Claire walked over immediately, knelt beside the child, and smiled with calm reassurance. "Do you know a secret?" she whispered. The little girl slowly shook her head. "Every great waitress has cleaned up 100 spills. Yours is only helping me practice number 101. The child laughed through her tears while her parents relaxed with visible relief. Ethan watched the entire exchange with quiet admiration. Nothing Claire did was extraordinary because it was dramatic. It was extraordinary because she made ordinary moments feel safe. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the familiar nursing textbook resting beside the service station once again. This time curiosity gently overcame hesitation. "May I ask you something?" he said as Claire handed him the receipt. She nodded. "Of course." Ethan glanced toward the worn book before meeting her eyes. "You read that every chance you get. Were you studying to become a nurse?" Claire looked at the cover for a long second before answering with an honest smile that carried both hope and quiet disappointment. "I still am. Life simply asked me to take a longer route than I expected." Those few words lingered in Ethan's mind long after he stepped back onto the busy sidewalk, because for the first time he realized that the woman everyone saw carrying dinner plates had never stopped carrying a dream as well. Claire's words stayed with Ethan throughout the following week in a way that surprised him. "Life simply asked me to take a longer route than I expected." They sounded less like an excuse and more like quiet acceptance. In his world, delays were problems to eliminate, obstacles to negotiate away, or numbers to solve with enough resources. Yet Claire spoke about interrupted dreams without bitterness. She simply kept walking. On Wednesday evening, Ethan returned to Ashford Grill after another day filled with meetings that had stretched far beyond sunset. The familiar warmth of the dining room greeted him before anyone recognized his arrival. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while candles flickered gently across polished tables. Claire noticed him as she carried a tray toward another section. She smiled, nodded politely, and finished serving her guests before walking over. "Good evening," she said. "You look like today asked a lot from you." Ethan laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious?" Claire tilted her head with a thoughtful smile. "Only because you usually notice everything around you. Tonight you walked past the dessert display without looking at it." Ethan glanced toward the glass case and realized she was right. He had not even noticed the seasonal pastries. I suppose I was distracted, he admitted. Claire handed him a menu, although she already knew his usual order. Then perhaps tonight calls for comfort instead of routine. The chicken pot pie has been making people smile all week. He accepted the recommendation without hesitation. As Claire disappeared toward the kitchen, Ethan found himself wondering how someone who worked long shifts on her feet still found enough emotional energy to notice small changes in complete strangers. During the evening, the restaurant became busier than expected after a nearby theater performance ended early. Every table quickly filled. Orders arrived faster than anyone anticipated. One server called in sick, leaving the remaining staff scrambling to cover additional sections. Claire quietly adjusted without complaint, helping coworkers deliver meals before returning to her own customers. At one point, she noticed a young couple celebrating what appeared to be an engagement. Their dessert arrived without the candle they had requested because the kitchen had run out. Claire disappeared for less than 2 minutes and returned carrying a simple tea light inside a small glass holder borrowed from the reception desk. The couple smiled as though they had been handed something priceless. Ethan watched from across the room, recognizing once again that Claire solved problems by asking one simple question. What would make this moment better for someone else? Later that evening, while she cleared his table, Ethan spoke more openly than he usually allowed himself. Can I ask why nursing? Claire paused with the empty coffee cup still in her hand. She considered the question carefully before answering. When my mother became sick, I spent months in hospitals. I met doctors who saved lives and nurses who helped people believe they could keep living. I realized there is a difference. Ethan listened quietly. Claire continued with the same calm honesty that had become so natural to her. I wanted to become the kind of person who could make someone's hardest day feel a little less frightening. And then life changed. Ethan asked gently. Claire nodded. Medical bills came first. Tuition came second. I kept telling myself I would go back next semester. Then next year. Eventually you stop talking about the dream because you do not want people to feel sorry for you. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before asking the question that had quietly formed in his mind days earlier. If money were not part of the decision, would you return tomorrow? Claire smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Tomorrow, she repeated softly. Absolutely. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card, placing it on the table instead of handing it directly to her. If you ever decide you would like to explore opportunities outside this restaurant, my office would be happy to help. Claire looked at the card but made no move to pick it up. Instead, she folded the dinner check, placed it beside him, and answered with quiet gratitude. That is very generous. Truly. But I cannot accept opportunities simply because someone feels grateful for one evening. Ethan seemed surprised. Most people accepted his offers before he finished making them. Claire continued before he could respond. You helped me because you believed it was the right thing to do. If my future changes, I want it to be because I earned it, not because I owe someone a favor. There was no pride in her voice. No accusation. Only dignity. Ethan slowly nodded, understanding that she had just given him something far more valuable than agreement. She had shown him a standard of self-respect that wealth could never purchase. As Claire walked away to greet another family entering the restaurant, Ethan quietly slipped the untouched business card back into his wallet, realizing that if he truly wanted to help her someday, it would have to be in a way that honored the independence she had worked so hard to protect. The following Tuesday evening began like countless others, with the steady hum of conversation filling Ashford Grill and the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Outside, a cool breeze carried the first hints of approaching winter through downtown Chicago. But inside the restaurant, every table was occupied by people celebrating birthdays, discussing business, or simply enjoying an ordinary meal after a long day. Claire moved through the dining room with the same quiet confidence that had become as familiar as the soft music overhead. She noticed empty water glasses before anyone asked, remembered which guests preferred lemon with their tea, and somehow made every table feel like the only one she was serving. Ethan arrived just after 6 o'clock, expecting nothing more than a peaceful dinner before reviewing documents waiting at home. He had begun looking forward to these evenings more than he admitted to himself. They reminded him that the world still contained people who measured success by the difference they made rather than the attention they received. As Claire passed his table with a friendly smile, An elderly gentleman near the center of the dining room suddenly stopped speaking. His fork slipped gently onto the table as he leaned back in his chair, looking confused and noticeably uncomfortable. The conversation around him slowed almost instantly. His wife reached for his hand, calling his name with growing concern. Several nearby guests stood uncertainly, unsure what to do next. Before anyone else reacted, Claire calmly placed the tray she was carrying onto the nearest service station and walked directly toward the couple. There was no panic in her face, only quiet focus. Kneeling beside the gentleman, she spoke in a steady, reassuring voice, introducing herself and asking simple questions while encouraging him to take slow, careful breaths. She asked another server to call emergency services and requested that someone bring the restaurant's first aid kit. Her words remained calm enough that the frightened wife gradually matched her breathing without realizing it. Ethan stood from his table, instinctively ready to help if needed, but quickly understood that Claire already had the situation under control. She gently encouraged nearby guests to create a little more space while reassuring everyone that help was on the way. No dramatic commands, no raised voice, just calm leadership born from preparation and compassion. The dining room, moments earlier filled with uncertainty, slowly settled because one person refused to let fear become contagious. Within a few minutes, paramedics arrived and took over the gentleman's care after thanking Claire for keeping both him and his wife calm until they arrived. Before leaving, the older man managed a small smile and quietly squeezed Claire's hand in gratitude. His wife embraced Claire with tearful appreciation before following the medical team outside. As the restaurant gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, several customers applauded softly, but Claire immediately smiled with gentle embarrassment and thanked everyone for their patience before returning to refill coffee cups as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ethan watched in complete silence. He had witnessed executives command boardrooms, attorneys dominate courtrooms, and politicians captivate thousands from enormous stages. Yet none of those displays of authority resembled what he had just seen. Claire had earned trust without demanding it. She had brought calm without seeking recognition. Later, after the evening rush finally eased, Ethan approached the service station where Claire was quietly organizing clean silverware. "You handled that beautifully," he said sincerely. Claire looked up with a modest smile. "I only remembered what my instructors taught me before I had to leave school. Most of it was simply staying calm so other people could stay calm too." Ethan studied her for a moment before asking, "Do you ever regret stopping?" Claire paused, holding a folded napkin between her hands. "Every day," she answered honestly. "But regret is not the same thing as giving up. I promised myself that even if I could not wear a nurse's uniform yet, I could still care for people wherever I happened to be." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, letting those words settle. In that quiet instant, he realized something that no financial success had ever taught him. The woman he believed he had rescued weeks earlier had been quietly rescuing others every single day, not through grand gestures or public recognition, but through patience, dignity, and the simple decision to place another person's well-being before her own. For the first time in many years, Ethan understood that true greatness often wore an ordinary uniform, carried a coffee pot instead of a title, and walked unnoticed through rooms filled with people who never stopped long enough to see it. The image of Claire calmly comforting frightened strangers stayed with Ethan long after he left Ashford Grill that evening. During the drive home, the city lights reflected across the windshield like scattered memories, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning a habit that had quietly shaped his entire career. Whenever he saw a problem, his first instinct was to solve it with resources. Whenever someone struggled, he searched for the fastest financial solution. Claire had shown him another way. Some things were not meant to be purchased. They were meant to be protected. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his headquarters before sunrise, carrying only a notebook instead of the usual stack of reports. His assistant, Melissa, immediately noticed the difference. "You look like you have already made a decision," she said with a curious smile. Ethan nodded. "I have, but this one has nothing to do with acquisitions." He spent the next 2 hours meeting with the director of his company's charitable foundation instead of his investment team. Rather than discussing publicity campaigns or corporate branding opportunities, he asked a different question. How many working adults abandon healthcare education every year because they cannot afford to finish? The answer surprised even him. Thousands. Nurses, medical assistants, emergency technicians, and caregivers often pause their education to support families, pay medical bills, or work multiple jobs. Many never returned despite excellent academic records. Ethan listened quietly as statistics filled the room, but behind every number he imagined one familiar face carrying a tray through a crowded restaurant while a worn nursing textbook waited beside a service station. By the end of the meeting, he had made one request. The foundation would establish a scholarship program dedicated to hospitality workers pursuing healthcare careers. Applicants would be evaluated anonymously through essays, recommendations, and academic commitment. No publicity campaign. No press conference. No scholarship named after him. The work would speak for itself. Several weeks passed before the program quietly opened for applications across Chicago. Claire knew nothing about its origin. Her life continued with its familiar rhythm of early mornings, double shifts, borrowed textbooks, and small acts of kindness that nobody expected and everyone appreciated. One rainy afternoon, her manager placed a flyer on the break room bulletin board beside the weekly schedule. "Someone dropped these off from a local education foundation," he said. "Thought a few of you might be interested." Claire barely glanced at it, while pouring coffee into a travel mug before the words near the bottom caught her attention. Financial assistance for hospitality professionals returning to healthcare education. She stopped moving. Her eyes carefully reread every sentence. Tuition assistance. Books included. Flexible scheduling support. Community mentorship. She folded the flyer and slipped it inside her notebook without saying a word. That evening, she sat at the small kitchen table inside her apartment with the application spread before her. Several blank pages waited patiently beside an essay prompt asking a simple question. "Tell us why caring for others matters to you." Claire stared at the paper for several minutes before finally picking up her pen. She did not write about hardship. She did not describe sacrifice. Instead, she wrote about her mother smiling at a nurse who remembered her favorite blanket. She wrote about frightened patients who relaxed after hearing a calm voice. She wrote about ordinary people whose quiet compassion became unforgettable during someone else's hardest day. When she finished, tears rested gently in her eyes, not because she felt defeated, but because she realized she had never truly stopped believing that one day she would return. A month later, Ethan visited Ashford Grill after another long week. He had intentionally avoided asking anyone whether Claire had applied because he wanted the process to remain completely fair. As he finished dinner, Claire approached with the check, her smile brighter than usual. "You seem happy tonight," Ethan observed. Claire laughed softly before reaching into the pocket of her apron. "I received an email this afternoon." She unfolded a neatly printed letter with careful hands. "I have been awarded a scholarship to return to nursing school next semester." Ethan looked at her with genuine delight that required no performance. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "You earned it." Claire nodded, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "That is exactly why it means so much. Whoever created this program believed complete strangers deserved another chance. They never asked for anything in return." Ethan smiled without revealing a single detail. Sometimes the best opportunities are created by people who understand that recognition is optional, but kindness is not. Claire carefully folded the letter and placed it back into her apron. Neither of them noticed that outside the restaurant window, the rain had finally stopped, allowing the first clear stars of the evening to appear above the Chicago skyline, quietly reminding them both that even the longest roads eventually lead back toward the dreams that never stopped waiting. 1 year later, the first warm days of spring returned to Chicago, painting the city with fresh light and the quiet promise that seasons always changed, even when life sometimes seemed unwilling to. Ashford Grill looked almost exactly the same from the outside. The familiar brick walls still welcomed regular customers. The same brass bell chimed gently above the front door. The aroma of fresh coffee still drifted onto the sidewalk each morning. Yet for Claire Bennett, everything had changed. She no longer arrived wearing a black apron and carrying an order pad. Instead, she occasionally stopped by after finishing clinical rotations at a nearby medical center, still carrying the same gentle smile that had once made strangers feel at home over dinner and now helped anxious patients believe tomorrow might be a little brighter. Her nursing instructors often praised her ability to remain calm under pressure, But Claire quietly smiled each time she heard those words because she knew that skill had not been learned inside a classroom. It had been shaped during countless evenings carrying trays through crowded dining rooms, listening before speaking, noticing people who felt invisible, and understanding that sometimes the greatest comfort was simply allowing another person to feel seen. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, she stepped through the familiar entrance of Ashford Grill, holding a small paper bag filled with homemade cookies. The kitchen staff greeted her like family. The hostess hugged her without warning. Even the chef, who rarely expressed emotion, proudly announced that one of his former waitresses had become the nurse everyone had expected she would be. Claire laughed, with genuine happiness, accepting every congratulations with the same humility she had always carried. She insisted that nothing extraordinary had happened. She had simply continued walking toward a dream that had waited patiently for her to catch up. Moments later, the front door opened once again. Ethan Walker entered wearing the same understated navy jacket he had worn during so many ordinary dinners over the previous year. Their eyes met almost immediately, and both smiled with the comfortable familiarity shared by two people who had quietly changed one another's lives without ever trying to. Ethan walked over as Claire poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one in front of him before he could ask. "Some things never change," he said with a smile. Claire laughed softly. "I remembered your order." They sat near the window where spring sunlight stretched across the polished wooden table. For a few peaceful moments, neither of them spoke. They simply watched families pass along the sidewalk while the city moved at its usual pace beyond the glass. Finally, Ethan looked toward the hospital identification badge clipped neatly to Claire's jacket. "It suits you," he said sincerely. Claire glanced down before smiling. "It still feels unreal some mornings." Ethan nodded. "I never doubted you would get here." Claire stirred her coffee thoughtfully before answering. "There is something I have wanted to tell you." Ethan waited quietly. "The scholarship changed my life," she said. "Not because someone paid tuition. Because someone believed people deserved another chance before they even knew our names." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Whoever created it was probably hoping exactly that. Claire smiled gently. "I hope I meet them someday so I can thank them." Ethan looked out the window, allowing the silence to answer before speaking carefully. Sometimes gratitude reaches people even when they never hear the words. Claire considered that for a moment, then nodded as though she somehow understood more than had been said. Before leaving, she reached into her bag and removed a folded envelope. The scholarship committee asked every graduate to write one letter for future applicants, she explained. "Mine says that dreams are patient. They wait for people who refuse to stop becoming who they were meant to be." Ethan accepted the envelope with quiet respect, knowing he would treasure it far more than any business award displayed inside his office. As Claire walked toward the door, she paused beside the same service station where everything had quietly begun one rainy evening long ago. She smiled at the memory before stepping outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. Ethan remained by the window, watching her disappear into the busy streets of Chicago, realizing that the most important investment he had ever made would never appear on a balance sheet. It lived instead in the confidence of one woman who had been given the opportunity to finish the journey she had never truly abandoned. And somewhere beyond the noise of the city, life whispered its quiet lesson once more. Never underestimate the person who serves with dignity today, because they may become the reason someone else finds hope tomorrow.